Hello and welcome back to the Lowdown, our weekly show where we bring you some of the deepest analysis on football YouTube. On today's show, we are running through the biggest problems facing your club this season. Today, we fix Man United's problems.
If you want to qualify for Europe, or if you want to in the long term be a title challenger in the Premier League, you have to be adapting every single game.
We talk through Spurs' defensive issues.
They conceded 61 goals last season. That is an awful lot of goals.
And what's gone wrong with Everton? It feels like Amadou Onana's departure has created an even bigger issue than I thought. Yes, welcome back to the show, everybody. Joining me as ever, we've got Michael McCubbin and Joe Tomlinson, who have both left their team behind after a heavy defeat.
We haven't.
Inter Milan shirts.
It's International Week, mate.
It is International Week. We will not be discussing international football.
We didn't coordinate this, by the way. This was totally by chance that there were two.
Take yours off.
A likely story.
I did spill some coffee down it earlier as well, but hopefully that won't be seen on camera.
Perfect. Yeah, we're not going to be discussing anything to do with international football. This week's show, we have identified some problems with some major sides in the Premier League so far in the first 3 rounds of fixtures, and we'll be trying to fix them. Guys, they're the story of the week. Your manager is the story of the week once again. Erik Ten Hag, Man United. Joe, a really demoralising defeat to Liverpool at the weekend. Was it a sign that things just are still not quite right at Man United? Was it individual mistakes? Where are you at with assessing your team?
It was a bit of a combination of everything I would say. Individual mistakes certainly contributed to it. Obviously, lots been made of Casemiro now, so we probably won't go back over that well-trodden ground. But clearly there are issues with the setup. I think last season the defensive numbers spoke volumes, didn't they? I think 15th in the league by expected goal difference per 90, 16th by expected goals conceded. It was a porous defence. Towards the back end of the season, the narrative was consistently over 20 shots, wasn't it? 25 shots per game being conceded. You just can't sustain that. Now, interestingly, as bad as United were on Sunday, the shot numbers have dramatically fallen this season. The pressing off the ball is definitely better, forcing some of the most high turnovers in the league.
I think it's second behind Liverpool, yeah.
But when little things start to go wrong, Mason Mount gets injured, and you lose that element of pressing off the ball, clearly the same fragility is there in the midfield patterns, because as everybody saw on Sunday, it's easy to cut through that midfield if you can get your passing systems right from the back, just like Liverpool did with Ryan Gravenberch playing 1-2s with Alexis McAllister, and you're able to just sieve through the midfield yet again. So I'm maybe not going to hammer Manchester United as much as some people have done over the last week, because I do think there have been some fundamental changes, but whether or not those fundamental changes are enough season-wide to make big differences in a positive way to Manchester United this season, I'm still slightly suspect.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think there's actually weirdly been quite a lot of revisionism about that United performance, especially on YouTube. Like lots of people being like, United weren't as bad as the scoreline suggests, or as bad as the nature of those goals. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, yes, okay, United created chances. Rashford created those 2 great chances for Joshua Zirkzee, but United
were 3-0 down.
3-0 down by the time that happened. I think United had 3 shots in total across the game until the 70th minute. By that point, Amad Diallo was on and was injecting a bit of life into the side, and Liverpool didn't really need to try all that hard in the final 20 minutes. They were able to conserve energy and sit back. So I think it's a skewed view when you just look at, say, the expected goal stats there.
Definitely.
Like United were pretty hapless going forward until that point. I think Mazraoui had 2 of those 3 shots, and him bombing forward was an issue, wasn't it? Clearly, when Casemiro was misplacing passes in the first half. So yeah, I think there are still big structural issues, and yes, you can say that United have been a better pressing unit this season across the first 3 games, and I certainly think the Brighton performance, despite the loss, was good in some ways. Did show some development from last season, but I still think to get onto the manager, whether things were working, say, against Fulham or Brighton, coming up against Liverpool is a completely different kettle of fish.
Absolutely.
Like we saw, Arne Slot, and okay, lots of praise being given on Arne Slot. Now let's see, where Liverpool are at in 3 months' time. I think that's going to be a better representation of his mark on the team. But even then, first 2 games of the season against Ipswich and Brentford, it looked like Liverpool had kind of changed their style of play under Arne Slot, and it was working to an extent. Gravenberch being this ball-playing number 6. Against United, it wasn't really an Arne Slot performance. It was kind of, let's revert back to how we hurt United under Jurgen Klopp, and Arne Slot was intelligent enough to be able to kind of abandon what he was doing in the first 2 games to hurt United, because that's where he knew United's weaknesses were.
The breakdown was brutal post-match, wasn't it? When Arne Slot just kind of decimated Manchester United.
And that's where I do have concerns about Ten Hag, because there doesn't seem to be enough of this pragmatism when it comes to the teams you're up against and the managers you're up against. You have, if you want to qualify for Europe, or if you want to in the long term be a title challenger in the Premier League, you have to be adapting every single game.
And it felt like at the end of last season, sorry to interrupt, it did feel like he was being slightly more pragmatic as well.
I think he started this season more pragmatic. I think it's a clear 4-2-4 shape in the first 2 games, and that is basically what United tried to do at the back end of last season, especially in that FA Cup final against Manchester City, where it was so effective, where you had the 2 split strikers. He tried to start the season like that. To be honest with you, one of the bigger problems I think has been developed because of that 4-2-4 system, we've just spoken there about maybe, build-up patterns. I think goal scoring becomes even more of an issue in the 4-2-4 when you don't play with that recognised number 9. It kind of works against big teams. Manchester City in the FA Cup final found it much more difficult to play against that Manchester United midfield because there wasn't a recognised striker. There was 2 8s that were pushing extremely high. But what you lose when you don't have a recognised striker is goal output, and that's already been a problem for Ten Hag across the first 2 campaigns as Manchester United manager. His team haven't scored 60 goals in a single Premier League season yet. That is pretty concerning in terms of goal output. The strikers don't get a huge amount of chances. XG suggests that they aren't one of the 3 or 4 best performing attacks in the league. So when you take a number 9 out of the picture and you replace him with another midfielder in that box, and you play the forwards really wide, often when they pick up the ball in dangerous areas, there's just nobody in the box to deliver the ball to that looks like they're going to score a goal. And I think that as good as that pressing system I spoke about earlier has looked in the first couple of games, it was decimated by Liverpool, and it also contributes to a malfunctioning attack, I think.
Yeah, I think it is worth pointing out you did have some key injuries to players that probably would have started or been close to starting. Mount, Yoro, ideally. He's still pretty raw, but he would have potentially been in line for a start if he played the first few games. Shaw's obviously a huge loss. Rasmus Højlund. And Mikey, before kickoff, Manuel Ugarte was unveiled. Really frustrating to not have him signed in time to play this game. And it already feels like there's a little bit of a hero thing going on here. The sort of guy that's going to come in and shore up that entire midfield. Do you think his presence would have made a significant difference on Sunday? And do you have any reservations? Because I have read some interesting articles about, we all know this, but he's not necessarily the best progressive passer. And neither maybe is Kobbie Mainoo, who's more of a very good dribbler in tight spaces and progressing through that way. Do you think that potential combination could have helped on Sunday? And do you see it instantly improving Man United?
Well, there are shades of Casemiro 2 years ago, aren't there? After United lost their first 2 games, and Casemiro is seen as the hero. But I think, look, I think Ugarte, in some ways, that there's favour to him in terms of coming into this team straight away, just because Casemiro's first half performance was so bad against Liverpool. I know that we saw Casemiro's performances drop off last year, and he gained a lot of criticism for it, but I don't think we saw, as much of a disaster in any game as we saw for him in the first half against Liverpool, and coming off at half time as well. It kind of feels like Ugarte just has to come in and just perform, at a very kind of base level, in order for us to see an improvement in that sense. But yeah, he's not the best progressive passer. He is an amazing tackler. He is certainly a lot more mobile than Casemiro. I think we're far less likely to see him get out-muscled off the ball by Luis Diaz than we saw with Casemiro. I think, the stage is set for him to come in. But like you say, he's not necessarily going to offer the progression from midfield. He's not going to be someone who can take the ball in the half turn and pass, to the forwards instantly. But then at the same time, Kobbie Mainoo has improved a little bit in that sense this season. Obviously, there's a lot of pressure to have on such a young player, but his pressing stats have improved a lot. His progressive pass stats have improved a little bit as well. I know it's a 3-game sample size. So, take from that what you will. But, there are improvements in Mainoo's game. The danger is that Ugarte were to come in, he's unfamiliar with Mainoo. Mainoo's unfamiliar with him. And, there are going to be teething problems in those first 2 games if they are to start together. That would be my concern, is that Mainoo might be, I think, is in danger of getting hung out to dry a little bit here, where he's getting given too much responsibility in that midfield when, this time last year he wasn't even in the team. So that would be my concern first and foremost. I think if we could see Manuel Ugarte regain some of the kind of responsibility that he had at Sporting, where he was actually given, more of a role in terms of actually progressing play or at least evading the press, then maybe this will be the perfect role for him. But we didn't see that at PSG. He obviously wasn't trusted towards the end of the season. So yeah, I think it's going to be a bigger challenge though. That's the thing. I think Ugarte at PSG, really, really high possession team. At United, I think he's going to be thrown more challenges than he was in Liga, and maybe that's actually what he needs.
Yeah, I have to say as well, just quickly on Kobbie Mainoo, I've seen some people sort of calling him out online for his performance. I thought he was pretty good against Liverpool. I think he was asked to do way too much. At the start of the season, I think his off-the-ball work has really improved. He looks physically a lot stronger. I think he's the interception leader for players in Europe's top 5 leagues. He's put up the most. So I think some of the criticism for him was quite harsh. I think interestingly about Ugarte, I know we talk about these progressive pass numbers. At times, I think United force it. United try to score with every single attack. And, that must be an instruction, you'd imagine. But these sort of long, raking passes they're always trying to play, I don't have a particular problem with a midfielder just coming in for a few games and just retaining the ball. 10 yards sideways passes will be fine in Manchester United's midfield.
Which Ugarte's always been great at.
Which Ugarte's actually been fine at. United's have a real hero ball complex where every ball is a 60-yard diagonal to Marcus Rashford, to Garnacho, trying to split the play into a striker. Let's just have somebody who comes in and just keeps the ball for 5 minutes and pops it around the midfield. United's lack of control on the ball means that the shape can never develop. Everything is played at 100 miles an hour because his first touch has got to go. The first goal that United conceded for Casemiro is because he's trying a first time wander ball, splitting the gap while the 2 foot just settle the ball down and let's just have a bit of retention in the midfield. And that is something Ugarte classically, both at Sporting and at PSG. Yes, he hasn't been a big pass progressor or a big progressive carrier, but he's been a ball retainer with a high volume of passes in midfield areas, which might just sell United down a little bit on the ball.
You would hope as well that with a bit more control there, that the tactic of both fullbacks pushing up as soon as possession is won actually then works in the favour, because as good as Mazraoui has been at passing out from the back, we're yet to see him really get on the ball in midfield consistently. In terms of the tactics against Liverpool, it was like he was in the final third a lot of the time. So if United can almost form a midfield 4, especially when Luke Shaw's back, who's also incredibly effective in the middle third of the pitch, then maybe we will see that shape
after the international break.
But yeah. It's a big ask though for a player who's just come in.
Yeah, there is a few problems.
But it's so early. A lot of panic.
It is very early.
It
is just slightly frustrating, I imagine, as Man United fans. Like, you've had a positive summer. I think many people would have said one of the best summers in the Premier League in terms of the age profile you brought in, clearing out some of the deadwood. But here we are, 3 games into the season. You've got 2 weeks to stew on a massive defeat to your biggest historical rival under a new manager who's into his 3rd game and already seems to have a more clear tactical identity than Ten Hag. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating because it feels like so much good work in the summer and through finishing the season with the FA Cup has kind of already been undone, and it feels like the noise around Man United is already massive.
But I think there's always, and we'll probably get onto this with some other teams that we talk about today, is that winning a transfer window, having a great summer, it always lures us in to being suddenly short-termists. Like, winning a transfer window does not mean you're going to be the best team in the league. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a massively improved season on the season before. I think United's transfer window really was notable for the amount of sales that they made and how that was then able to fund the players being brought in, and how that is, I think, a positive look to the future of how United conduct transfer business. But it also unsettles the team. So many players, moving out. McTominay, who was, played a big role actually last season. Agate coming in late. Xerxes getting up to speed. Yoro getting injured. Like, United's squad is more unsettled than it was this time last year. And so I think, and also unfortunate to play Liverpool so early in the season as well, and for that to already be a sticking point. And I think Ten Hag is right to face scrutiny over that. But I think it's wishful thinking to think, oh yeah, we got 5 new players in, that's going to suddenly, improve this team. Look at like De Ligt. It was De Ligt's first start against Liverpool, and he had a very strong first half, had a real second half to forget as well. And what does that do to morale? I think like him and Lissandra obviously have to be the centre back pairing going forward. But it was their first game playing together. Yeah, absolutely. We do have plenty of teams to get through, including teams at the bottom of the table as well, in the likes of Southampton and Everton. But let's move on to Arsenal. Feels a little bit different.
Problems have they got?
Well, exactly. It feels very different to Man United. But there are people, particularly online, slightly concerned, I think, by the fact that City have got off to such a strong start. Notorious slow starters in the last few years. And the fact that Arsenal, now have to go into a North London derby without Declan Rice, that's far from ideal as well. I mean, Mikey, you also look at the level that Liverpool have started this season as well. I think a lot of people underestimated how well they'd start. The fact they were on for a quadruple in mid-March.
They've only dropped 2 points though, Dukes.
I totally agree.
Dropped 2 points,
I totally
Arsenal.
agree. But I think people forgot that Liverpool were top of the league in early April last year. And yes, they had a really poor end to the season, but I think people underestimated their squad. But let's talk Arsenal, completely different from Man United. Mikey, if there are any problems, what are they?
Well, I think you summarised it pretty well there. I don't think Arsenal have any major problems, really. It's just the fact that City have started on absolute fire, Liverpool have started on absolute fire, and 2 points behind already. It just feels like Arteta already doesn't have that much leeway. And you consider that Mourinho,
so early here, man.
But I just think that by the end of October, Arsenal could be significantly further behind, given that they've got some fairly tough fixtures
Spurs
coming
away,
up.
City away.
They've got Spurs away, then Atalanta, then City away. Atalanta away as well. I don't think they play at home until the end of the month. Then they've got Leicester at home, Southampton at home, then Bournemouth away. But then from the end of October, they have Liverpool, Newcastle, Inter and Chelsea all in a row as well. It feels like quite a tough period coming up, especially when Mourinho's come in and now won't be available till the end of October with that injury, Rice out of the next game. It just feels like there's a lot of pressure on that Spurs game when Man City have a considerably more favourable run of fixtures between now and the end of October. So it just feels like if I was to predict, it feels like now that the narrative of this title race will probably be Arsenal chasing City in the first half of the season, whereas in seasons gone by, it hasn't necessarily been like that. Arsenal were the early pace setters 2 years ago, weren't they? Last year, it was a bit more of a three-way thing, but Arsenal really emerged in the new year as the strongest team in the league. So, look, I think Arsenal still have, obviously, a massive shot at the league, but it just feels like there's a lot of pressure on them early doors. And, compared to a month ago, again, like we fall into this trap in terms of who's had the better transfer window. A lot of people, probably the majority of people, were saying that Arsenal were favourites going into the season off the back of that window. Fast forward a month, City have got Gundogan through the door. Savio started really, really well. And Erling Haaland looks like he could break his record from 2 years ago as well, which wasn't the case last year, where this time last year, Erling Haaland, was missing the majority of chances he was getting. And he's already got 7 goals to his name. Yeah, he has been absolutely lethal. To play devil's advocate on that, I would say that 7 points from 9 games when you've played Villa, who finished in the Champions League spots, and Brighton when you're down to 10 men, I don't think it's a disaster whatsoever. I just think on the basis of what we've seen, and yes, it is only 3 games before all the Arsenal fans get really angry in the comments,
I don't think they've been as dominant as they were towards the end of last season when they went on that amazing run. And I don't think they've played as well as Man City or Liverpool. But there's no shame in that. They've got new players to adapt as well. Joe, there's potentially more to get at with Tottenham because it doesn't feel like, despite the additions in the summer, that much has changed stylistically. We're seeing the same problems come back and bite them.
I think defensively, I think they've looked really good though. Tottenham at the start of the season, to be honest with you. I know that they haven't picked up the points necessarily that they've deserved, but definitely should have taken 3 points from that Leicester game. I thought they performed really, really well, and I thought they should have beaten Newcastle at the weekend too. Dominic Solanke's injury, I think, has hindered them a little bit in terms of their finishing. The only concern, the problem that I think you can see developing is that defensive situation. They conceded 61 goals last season. That is an awful lot of goals. I think across the last 7 seasons, they were averaging 38 goals conceded per season. So not too bad. You think back to that excellent season they had under Pochettino, which is really the kind of Tottenham benchmark of best seasons in recent years, isn't it? They conceded 26 goals. They conceded 61 goals last year. That is a monumental amount. And I just think the reason that they get exposed is that high line. And when you don't have Mickey van der Ven fit, you have issues with that high line. Obviously, the problem on the weekend was a lack of pressure on the ball. Joe Linton was able to turn out way too easily and play the ball in behind. But when Mickey van der Ven isn't there with his recovery and covering pace, to have a line situation that is like that, you are suspect to concede goals away from home. And their away form, because of the vast amount of goals they're conceding away from home, doesn't look great, does it? I think there has to be maybe a slight adaptation or maybe a slight personnel change. I was surprised they didn't sign another centre-back in the summer as well, because they can't continue to concede goals away from home at the volume they currently are.
Yeah. What was frustrating as well, I imagine, from a Spurs perspective, is that I felt both goals were quite avoidable as well. The first one, Romero goes on this he's got a little bit of main character syndrome where he just runs out way out of the line. The ball goes out for a throw and he's out of position. And then for the second one, he's trying to play over and offside when no one else is. And then his effort to get it back as well, I thought was quite poor. And look,
I don't think it helps he's playing as left-sided centre-back.
Left-sided centre-back without Van der Ven. But then,
moved out
again, we talked about it all summer. Did they strengthen enough in full-back positions in terms of depth? Should they have signed a fourth centre-back? Quite possibly as well. Having said that, I do kind of agree with you. I think some of their attacking players have started the season really well. I think Odobert has surprised me with how well he's adapted to that side already. Brennan Johnson's made a big difference in games that he's come on as well. It just feels like they have to do a lot to win games securely.
But I just think that's because they're missing chances at the moment. I think they've got the capabilities to absolutely start blowing teams away if Dominic Solanke can start taking his chances. And if that back four can stay fit throughout this season, then they are going to be a seriously dangerous side. If you look at last season, when that best back four started, which you would say is Udogie, Van der Ven, Romero and Pedro Porro, they started 19 of 40 games together. With that back four, they were conceding 1.26 goals a game. Without them, they were conceding 1.81. So if you extrapolated that across the course of the season, if they've got the best back four there, it's the fourth best defence in the league.
Yeah.
If they don't have the best back four there, it's the fifth worst defensive record in the league. That swing is monumental. So that has to be tightened down.
What was mental last year was there was a record amount of goals in the league, and pretty much everyone's defence was terrible last year. There was only 4 sides who I think was City, Arsenal, Liverpool and Everton randomly who conceded less than 58 goals in the league. The year before that, 13 sides conceded less than 58. It was just goals everywhere. Yeah. Goals galore last year. Chelsea were really poor defensively. Newcastle were really poor compared to their usual standards defensively. Spurs were at points all over the place with some injuries as well. It did feel it was a season of just complete chaos in backlines. But Mikey, with Spurs' system, they need a little bit more assuredness at the back.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. I think there does have to be a bit of an adaptation, but at the same time, can we really expect Ange Postecogolou to do that? He had so many opportunities to change that high line last year, and he didn't. It feels like it's here to stay, and Van der Ven is back soon. But I think really, again, it's about building that relationship, right? I think, like, you know, if Dragusin and Romero have better communication against Newcastle, then I think both of those goals can be avoided, especially the second one. It just feels like something needs to be said there, like, because otherwise Romero's just there, kind of thinking that everyone's going to be, you know, pushing up with him, and that hasn't happened. And I think Dragusin, you know, especially on the ball, I think looks great. Like, I think he was a really, really good signing for Spurs, but, you know, hasn't played a huge amount yet and hasn't developed that relationship yet. I think once that's happened, once he's had more time to bed in, I mean, I feel like I'm maybe, you know, giving him too much here because he has been, you know, at the club for a number of months now, but it does feel like they've got a very strong kind of first choice 3 centre backs there. But I think that was a real opportunity missed against Newcastle. I think they had the chance to, you know, really put that recent hoodoo against them to bed. They've really been their bogey team, haven't they? Newcastle and Alexander Isak, his scoring record against them at St James's Park. You know, to gift him a goal like that. But as for going forward, yeah, I think only Nottingham Forest have taken more shots than them in the league. But I think their shot placement hasn't been good enough. I think they've taken an awful lot of shots from outside the box. Yeah. You'd hope that once Solanke's back, that, you know, with that focal point in the centre, they'll begin to work around him a lot more. Of course, like at Bournemouth, he was just the master of being in the right place for those cutbacks, wasn't he, last year? And I think that's a lot of chances when he was on the pitch against Leicester as well. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think on another day, he puts a couple away, doesn't he? And I think that's, you know, Tottenham's play it's centred around that, because I mean, Odegaard, I think, is a decent finisher actually, but Brennan Johnson's still very raw in that aspect. I think he's far better when he's got someone there to cut back to. I think that attack could come alive once he's back in. Yeah, absolutely. Just finally on Dragusin, I thought some of his recovery tackles on the weekend were amazing. I did as well. I was a little bit worried really at different points because he's not lights out quick, but he timed those tackles really, really impressively. He's pretty fast, man. He's just not Van der Ven. He's just not Van der Ven, to be fair. Right, let's continue the therapy session with a discussion about Newcastle, the side that beat Spurs on Sunday. Joe, I think Eddie Howe has freely admitted in post-match interviews that they haven't really been at their best so far this season. But there are obvious counterpoints in that they've had injuries and they didn't really have the window they wanted to either. Yeah, absolutely. The depth is really being questioned again at Newcastle. Last season, injuries were the defining factor of their campaign, weren't they? And at the start of this season, they've been a defining factor already. You look at that back four that was put out against Tottenham, and it really wasn't ideal, was it? I mean, from a Newcastle fan's perspective, that's partly down to, you know, the suspension, the very questionable suspension of Fabian Schär, but also Botman has been out long term and will continue to be out long term. They clearly wanted to sign a centre back in the summer, as we saw with the extended pursuit of Mark Gahey, and it didn't happen. So I think Eddie Howe kind of has every right to be a little bit irritated that he hasn't got more players through the door to support this squad, which looked thin last season and hasn't really been added to. Like, we can talk about Will Asula, certainly has a future at the club, and obviously we like Lloyd Kelly in the left-back, centre-back hybrid role, but there was additions to be made in wide areas, wasn't there? I think they thought Minter might be coming back to the club and having an impact in that right-wing slot, but he's obviously been sold. They've lost a midfielder in Elliot Anderson, who started the season well at Forest, and without having Botman in the side, the defensive unit looks thin, so I do feel a little bit sorry for Eddie Howe, and they desperately need to get, you know, players back to fitness, don't they, in the back line? Yeah. Mikey, is there any reason to sort of question how they're doing stylistically? Because last year their attack was amazing. The year before that was their defence. Was that just injury related, or is there something stylistic that you've spotted about Newcastle? I think in terms of this season, it's hard to say. Like, it's hard to say exactly how we should expect Newcastle to play going forward. You know, that first game, albeit, you know, that Schär red card early on in the game, they only had 23% of the ball against Southampton at home. Yes, Southampton have been, you know, we'll get onto them a bit, but, you know, they've sustained the second biggest possession behind Man City in the league this season. Then had 61% of the ball away at Bournemouth in a game in which, you know, they weren't really the better side. And then again ceded possession to Spurs. So I think we need a 7 or 8 games against a bigger variety of opposition for us to really see what Newcastle are about this season. But one thing that has been trending downwards over the last 2 years is their pressing. You know, in that season in which their defence was so imperious, I think it was the joint best in the league alongside champions Manchester City, the season that they got Champions League football. I think they were among the 3 or 4 highest pressers in the league. That then came down a bit last year. And again, we can talk about injuries there because, when you're having to field so many different starting 11s, how on earth are you meant to sustain a consistent pressing system? Like it's really, really difficult. It would be really, really difficult for Jurgen Klopp, yes, let alone Eddie Howe, who's working with a much more limited squad, at least in certain areas of the pitch. And I think that's what brings us on to their key issue, really. And I think it's a more deep-seated issue, and it's what actually their transfer business has looked like over the last 3 years. They've been a really, really bad selling club since the new ownership have come in. And, I remember back in 2021 when the PIF took over Newcastle, and it felt like, having seen the kind of model of Manchester City and other clubs who had been taken over by billionaire owners in recent years, that it wouldn't be splashing the cash at every available opportunity, and it hasn't been, because Newcastle have on the whole been pretty well run under PIF. But I think what we didn't anticipate was how PSR would come into play, and the fact that Mike Ashley didn't leave a Newcastle squad with many sellable assets whatsoever.
Many diamonds in the rough.
That's still hurting Newcastle as a club. I think they've made around 183 million euros worth of sales since 2021, which I think ranks them 19th of 26 clubs to have played in the Premier League during that time. That's below the likes of Watford. And so it's meant that Newcastle have had a summer like this summer where they weren't able to meet Crystal Palace's valuation for Mark Gehey because they were scared about what that would mean for their transfer business in the future. It meant that they were desperately trying to sign Anthony Elanga on the final day, having done so before the PSR cut-off as well back in June. Yankuba Minter to Brighton for a very good fee, but their right wing slot desperately needs upgrading, and I think he would have been starting for Newcastle this season if he hadn't been sold. Let's be honest. I think Jacob Murphy, is now first choice there. He is not the player who I don't think you ideally want to be playing for a side with Champions League ambitions.
I think they'll go Gordon and Barnes, though, won't they? They will go Gordon and Barnes.
But Barnes' injury record, isn't amazing. Certainly, last season had fitness issues, and he's also not a natural fit there. Harvey Barnes is still better off the left, and we saw Gordon filling in on the right as well against Tottenham. But I just think, they're just still very thin on the ground there. And again, we go back, centre-back depth is an issue too. And I think, something like 5 of their defenders are all into their 30s now. They've got the 4th oldest squad in the league.
Trippier's situation.
I think that's what it boils down to for Newcastle. It feels like they've got the same problems as they did last year. A few injuries to that squad. Of course, Tonali coming back is a massive thing. But again, I think that was the area of the pitch where they didn't really have problems despite so many injuries last year. The midfield was able to adapt. The defence less so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is an issue going forward in terms of selling players as well, because the players that they'd probably least want to sell are Isak, Bruno Guimaraes and Anthony Gordon. They were all brought in for fairly sizable money as well, so the upturn in terms of selling them is not really there. Who's going to spend £100 million plus on Bruno Guimaraes or Isak in this market?
Somebody should spend it on Isak.
Yeah,
he's the outstanding young.
But also Newcastle can't really afford to sell those players, though. Really, if they want to sustain their improvement, then they have to keep hold of those players. And there's not really anyone else to sell.
Okay, the therapy session continues with a trip to the South Coast. Southampton probably need more therapy than most, I would have thought, their fan bases at the moment, or their fan base. Joe, it's been perfectly pretty on the eye. It's not been particularly effective, and the signs are quite worrying.
Yeah, it's kind of what we were expecting, though. We know Russell Martin has a very specific approach to how he wants to play football, and this is with this heavy, ball-dominant, retaining possession style of football, passing out from the back. It completed 28,000 passes across the Championship season last year. I think Leicester completed 26,000. We know how Enzo Maresca was hyped. The third best team completed 22,000. So we're talking about huge numbers, and that's continued in the Premier League, hasn't it? Across the first 2 games of the season before the weekend's fixture, they completed 1,200 passes. Since 2003, when Opta first began gathering data, only 2 teams have ever matched that, and that's Tuchel's Chelsea and Sarri's Chelsea. So these are record-breaking possession-based stats. They are keeping 70% of the ball in big games away at Newcastle. It's massive, but it's fairly ineffective possession, and it's possession that is costing them in build-up phase. 3 major errors leading to goals have cost them big time already this season. The McCarthy error away at Newcastle comes from trying to build out from the back. They've obviously tried to fix that by signing Aaron Ramsdale, and I think it's an excellent purchase. But then against Brentford, 2 monumental errors from Harwood Bellis and Jan Bednarak building out from the back. There was nearly a third as well, wasn't there? And the issue starts to develop when you jump up from the Championship to the Premier League. You've had a really strong, style of play where you are going to keep hold of the ball. The pressing systems in the Premier League are so much more advanced than you see in the Championship that if it's not spot on, and you make mistakes, you will be punished. You absolutely will be punished. And they were punished in the Championship as well. Let's not forget that. They conceded 63 Championship goals. Birmingham got relegated and conceded 65. So it was a fairly porous defence anyway at Championship level. When you jump up to the Premier League, you're punished to an even higher degree, and I think that leaves question marks about some of the defensive recruitment potentially, whether or not it's settled enough and ready to play the ball out from the back against these super advanced pressing structures and really hyper clinical finishers. I think Southampton are going to stick with this style of play, and fair play, that is their prerogative, and that's Russell Martin's style of football. But what almost impressed me most about Russell Martin last season is when you think to the playoffs, particularly that playoff final, he adapted, moved away from the 4. He went back to the 3. He went more pragmatic. He went into a far more defensive and far more rigid structure. And I wonder across the season, as things start to develop, if we will see Southampton kind of emulate that. Will they move into a slightly more pragmatic defensive structure than we've seen at the start of the season, where frankly they've given up too much XG. They've given up, I think, 5.5 XG already in 3 games. Like, that's trending out at least 70 goals conceded across the course of the season, and they've played, no disrespect to Brentford and Forest, but they haven't played a City, they haven't played an Arsenal, they haven't played a Liverpool, they haven't played one of these absolute killers at the top of the league. I think the possession is here to stay, but it just needs to be slightly more considered and slightly more effective.
It almost feels like they missed out on, or they, it was an oversight in the summer not to target a slightly more experienced kind of defensive midfielder in there as well, someone who can actually receive that.
I like the Ugachukwu. I do like the Ugachukwu.
Ugachukwu was good, but he's again he's so young. He's 20 years old, and we're yet to see him fully bedded into this side. But yeah, among their midfielders, I think only Joe Aribo and Adam Lallana are over the age of 25. There's not a huge amount of experience there.
I actually liked some of their business though. Like in terms of the window, I like. Defensively, yeah, potentially. I think the Ugachukwu move was really good, and they have at least covered themselves for if they do drop back down by signing players that they had on loan that they knew worked really well in the Championship. I think the Flynn Downs move was really impressive, as was the Harwood Bellis move. The Ramsdale move was pretty good as well. I think Sugawara took his goal excellently on the weekend.
He's been my brightest player, I think.
Such a nice finish. So they have covered themselves a little bit. It's just that centre back.
Yeah, my issue is probably with their squad as well. I think there's a bit of a lack of creativity in that squad as well. I think only Lallana so far and Sugawara, who's a right wing back, have averaged over 0.2 expected assists per 90. That's a little bit troubling. And their top assist provider last year was actually Adam Armstrong, who's I think been really ineffective so far in the opening few games. He obviously doesn't have the best record in terms of Premier League impact as well. Behind that was Stuart Armstrong as well. It feels like some of their signings that they have made in the last few years to add a little bit of creativity and a spark, your Sulemanas, or Joe Aribos, etc., haven't really landed as you'd expect, and they've been left with a lot of very tidy footballers, but not that much natural creativity is what I would say at the moment. So I'm a little bit worried for Southampton, if I'm totally honest. After the international break, they've got Man United, then they've got Everton, the League Cup, then Ipswich and Bournemouth. So not the hardest run of fixtures in terms of Ipswich and Bournemouth in the league coming up, and Man United in their current state as well. But yeah, they've got to get some points on the board quickly, otherwise things could get quite depressing. Let's move on to Everton as well. Wow, what a result on the weekend for Bournemouth. Absolutely extraordinary. Everton have lost their first 3 games. They haven't won a game in August since August 2021. It's pretty crazy record. So in their last 11, they've drawn 3 and lost 8, which is really pretty troubling. And obviously, there are some mitigating factors in their results so far this season. I thought they played okay against Brighton on the opening day. Ashley Young gets sent off. Brighton were far more clinical. Then obviously against Bournemouth, I thought they played really well for the first 80 minutes, then seemed to run out of steam. And the defending for the goals is pretty inexcusable, really. And they concede so many goals that were so similar in nature as well. Pretty worrying for a Sean Dyche side as well. And the stats are a similar sort of story as last season as well. 19th for possession per game with 38%. That's down from 40%. They invite so much pressure onto themselves. They're 19th for pass accuracy as well. They're not building up effectively. And it feels like Amadou Onana's departure has created an even bigger issue than I thought. And that's with Oregbenen having started really well, at least off the ball. But on the ball, his pass accuracy is below 70% in the centre of the park.
I think he's been all right though, man.
I think he has as well.
Been good.
But can you succeed in the Premier League with a central midfielder that has got that lower pass accuracy?
I don't think that will continue season wide though. I think he's a really impressive ball driver. Like every time I've watched him so far this season, I thought he's probably been Everton's best player. Although I would agree with that. Dye as well can do it.
I would agree with that. I just think that is a little bit of a worrying sign if you're relying on Idrissa Gueye in the centre of the park, who's deep into his 30s, and Oregbenen, who doesn't seem like the most natural builder of possession. Yes, James Garner should come back from injury as well.
Or Mangala as well.
Mangala's now in as well. Hopefully he has a big impact as well, because I thought actually towards the end of his spell at Forest, he was one of their more impressive players. But it does seem like their squad is not in the best of shapes. Only Fulham and West Ham have played an older average 11 so far this season. It is a little bit troubling. The thing is, I think there are worse sides in the division than this year.
Yeah.
You'd be crazy to get rid of Sean Dyche, and I think the pressure on him already is absolutely mental. Joe, what would be your kind of changes that you'd want to see from Dyche?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important Everton just don't panic here. Don't panic, because let's put it into very simple context. At Bournemouth, they're probably a better team than Everton, and people really like how Iraola has got them playing. They play excellent football. The underlying numbers are superb. Everton were far better than them for 81, 82 minutes of that game. Yes, they capitulated, but there's definite positives to Everton this season. I think Ndiaye is very good. Oregbenen seems like an excellent player, but there is a problem with the mental fragility at Everton. Clearly, there is something under the surface that isn't quite right there. And I think that might well stem back from the fact that the football they play is very sort of, it's attritional, isn't it? So when things are going right, you can stand by the results and you can say, look, things are not the prettiest to watch, but we get results here. It's going to keep us in the division. When results start to turn, I think then people suddenly go, well, the style of football's terrible as well, isn't it? And we're losing results here. So when there's moments of negativity in games, I think that bubbles up really, really quickly. Last season, they won 13 games. But 12 of those 13 games came with less than 50% possession. So, even when they're winning games, it is not the prettiest to watch. And the one win that came with above 50% possession, I think, was against Sheffield United, which was 58% possession, who were all over the place. Also, the second lowest amount of goals of any team last season. So when things aren't going right, it's kind of stand out
when
to
you're
be
imploding.
When results aren't going right, it's stand out to be it's a tough watch this. Some sides you can kind of say, we might not be getting results, but it's so fun to watch us. You can see what they're trying to do. I think that is difficult. And I also think there is a problem when they concede goals mentally. They've gone 1-0 down 16 times. They haven't won any of them. They've only drawn 3 of them. There is a problem with battling against adversity. I think Man United have a similar issue as well. And that stems back, it feels like it's quite intrinsic at the club at the moment. I think it almost stems to the off-the-field issues that are happening at Everton with the ownership issues and with the wider problems that any sort of adversity is a struggle right now.
Feed off the fans, I'm sure.
Well, and you get onto the fans as well. It does feel like asking a lot of the fans again this season. Because obviously, moving into Bramley Moor next year, but the anxiety's over. If Everton get relegated, having to start at that stadium in the Championship, obviously huge. I think just the general kind of feeling I find from Everton fans online is just like, this is just the hardest team to support in the league, isn't it? There's always going to be an expectation because you're a historically massive club. You've got one of the most dedicated fan bases. But when Goodison empties out, you really feel it, don't you? Like if you're seeing bad football and you're seeing poor results, then as much as Goodison can be, the driving factor behind, a great run of results, it can also, if it's bad, it's really, really bad. The one thing I will say is that I think the Oral Mangala signing, like if it comes off, could be quite transformative. Like I think what he doesn't offer, he doesn't offer the physicality of say Amadou Onana. But like you were saying, I think Eregbanan can, in time replicate that a little bit. I think in terms of his driving runs from deep, what Oral Mangala does offer is a bit more control, a little bit more press resistance. And I think with an aging Idrissa Gueye, shouldn't really be starting for this Everton team anymore. I think Mangala can hopefully eventually take his place and just offer that control a little bit more. And I think that ability to be able to slow the game down is going to be massive for Everton this season.
Yeah. What I think is quite interesting compared to previous years is that Dyche is almost saying, at least in the press, like, look at what I've got and how little I've been backed. Whereas before it would always be like, no, we're in this together sort of vibe. And it does feel like he's being a little bit more negative than he has in previous years. And I do kind of get it. Everton made a £27 million net profit on transfers this year. Last year, it was close to 36. The year before, it was a £16 million profit. The year before that, it was £6 million profit. They haven't spent more than they've earned in terms of transfers.
Got to be careful
for the last
though with
4
PSR,
years.
man. They have
exactly.
to be careful.
100%. They're still paying the price for Mashiri's misguided, signings over the years. We don't need to go all over them as well, but Sigurdsson, Walcott, number of players, etc., signed for huge amounts of money, didn't really come off. So he has been left with a difficult situation, and losing a key player in Amadou Onana has seemingly knocked the team quite considerably. But I'm kind of with you guys. You got to hold tight.
Patience. They're going to be
use
okay.
the new players as well.
Yeah.
Jacob Braan is there to be used.
Yeah,
Use
hasn't been used yet. Once Branthwaite comes back, that will be a big positive as well. Right back is obviously a massive issue when you've still got Seamus Coleman and Ashley Young starting. I think that's one area that I feel like Sean Dyche was certainly frustrated about.
Though. I feel like Jack Harrison's balls from wide, Dwight McNeil.
I really like Ndai, man. I think he drives the ball really, really well, runs the ball really well. I think it was quite notable that when he came off 83rd, 84th minute of the weekend, it felt like, oh no, we've lost everything going forward. We lost all of that sort of ability to run past and drive the ball up the field.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, that is it for this week's Lowdown. I hope you guys enjoyed our analysis on problems facing a multitude of clubs in the Premier League this season and some solutions too. Did you guys agree with them? Did you not? If you didn't agree, get in the comments. Suggest what you do to fix those problems, and we'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.